The cold was a living thing. It burrowed through the fabric of his fatigues, past skin and muscle, and settled deep into his bones. It was a permanent resident now, a parasite that fed on warmth and hope. Trainee Miller lay in the surf, the Pacific Ocean's frigid wash pulling at him like an undertaker. Each wave was a shovel of wet sand on his grave. Around him, other bodies shivered and groaned. They were a single, miserable organism, linked by the heavy log they held above their heads. Their collective pain was a low hum that the roar of the ocean nearly drowned out. Instructor Thorne stood on the dry sand, a silhouette against the pre-dawn gray of Coronado. His voice was a rasp of gravel and scorn. "Still with us, Miller?" Miller did not answer. He couldn't. His jaw was locked, his teeth chattering a frantic, uncontrollable rhythm. His world had shrunk to the burning in his shoulders, the bite of the salt water in the sores on his back, and the splintered reality of the log. "I asked you a question, Tadpole." Thorne's voice cracked like a whip. "You thinking about Mommy? Thinking about a warm bed? Is that what's on your mind?" The other instructors, flanking Thorne like jackals, chuckled. It was a familiar ritual. Thorne always found one. One trainee to make an example of, one weak link to grind into dust until he broke. This week, it was Miller. Miller was unremarkable. He was of average height, average build, with a face that was easy to forget even before it was coated in sand and exhaustion. He did not excel. He did not fail spectacularly. He just endured, a quiet ghost moving through the brutal ballet of basic underwater demolition/SEAL training. It was this quietness, this lack of visible fire, that seemed to infuriate Thorne the most. "Look at him, gentlemen," Thorne announced to the class. "This is what a quitter looks like before he quits. The eyes are gone. The soul is gone. Just a meat puppet waiting for the strings to get cut." Miller squeezed his eyes shut. "Just hold the log. Just breathe. He didn't come here to be a hero. He came here to disappear, to erase the man he was supposed to be and become someone anonymous, someone defined only by the uniform he wore." But the uniform felt like a shroud now. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. It offered no warmth. For the men in the water, it was just a clock ticking down another hour of Hell Week. They had been awake for 4 days. Their bodies were screaming, their minds frayed into thin, hallucinatory threads. "On your feet," Thorne bellowed. The men struggled to rise, the log a monstrous burden. Miller's legs trembled, threatening to buckle. The man next to him, a broad-shouldered farm boy named Chun, grunted with effort, his face a mask of agony. They staggered out of the surf, a centipede of misery, and began the soul-crushing march back to the grinder. The grinder was the heart of BUD/S. It was a vast courtyard of asphalt, painted with white footprints and flanked by pull-up bars and dipping stations. At its center stood the bell. It was a simple brass bell with a rope lanyard, polished by the hands of countless broken men. Ring it 3 times, and the pain stopped. Ring it 3 times, and you were a failure. Thorne ran circles around their formation, his verbal assault relentless. He zeroed in on Miller again. "You're a disgrace, Miller. You're stealing the air of better men. Why are you even here? You don't have the blood for this. You don't have a name for this." That word, name, pricked something deep inside Miller. For a moment, the fog of exhaustion cleared, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of something he couldn't identify. Log on the ground. They dropped the massive timber with a synchronized groan of relief. Before they could straighten, the next order came. Pushing position, they fell to the asphalt, the grit pressing into their raw palms. "I want to hear you count. You will thank me for the privilege of this pain." Thorne roared. They began to push. The counting was ragged, breathless. Miller's arms shook with each repetition. He could feel the eyes of the instructor cadre on him. They circled him, their boots scuffing the ground near his head. "I've got $50, says he doesn't see noon," one of them muttered, just loud enough for Miller to hear. "You're on," another replied. "I say he pops before breakfast. Look at him. He's already gone." It became a game. a spectator sport. The public humiliation was part of the design, another tool to separate the wheat from the chaff. But with Miller, it felt different. It felt personal. Later that day, during a land navigation exercise, Miller's team got hopelessly lost. They were hours late to the checkpoint, earning a brutal round of surf torture for their failure. Thorne held up the compass Miller had been issued. "Who was a navigator?" he demanded. "I was Instructor Thorne," Miller said, his voice hoarse. Thorne held the compass up to his own. He shook his head in disgust. "You can't even read a compass, Miller. You led your team into a swamp. You failed them. You're a liability." Miller knew the compass was off. He had felt it, that subtle, wrong pull. But to say so would be an excuse, and excuses were poison here. He took the punishment, his body submerged in the cold water again, his teammates shivering beside him, their resentment a palpable force. That night, the final provocation came. They were carrying their inflatable boats, the heavy IBS, on a forced march through the soft sand of the beach. Miller's boat crew was falling behind. He was at the front, his head and shoulders bearing the brunt of the weight. His legs were giving out. He stumbled, and the front of the boat dipped, throwing the balance off. The entire crew collapsed in a heap of tangled limbs and curses. Thorne was on them in an instant. He kicked the side of the boat, his boot making a dull thud. He hauled Miller to his feet by the front of his fatigues. His face was inches from Miller's. "You are done," Thorne hissed, his voice low and venomous. "I have seen men break. I have seen men cry. I have seen men crawl away from this beach. But you're just empty. A ghost. There is nothing inside you. No fight. No fire. No history. You have no name worth remembering." And that was it. The final thread snapped. It wasn't the pain. It wasn't the exhaustion. It was the absolute negation of his existence. The declaration that he was a void, a hollow man. Miller slowly, deliberately, pulled himself free from Thorne's grasp. He turned and looked at the distant, gleaming form of the brass bell. The other instructors fell silent. The trainees held their breath. This was the moment. He started walking. Each step was a monumental effort. His body screamed in protest. His feet, raw and swollen, felt like blocks of cement dragging through the sand. The walk was 100 yards, but it felt like 100 miles. It was the walk of shame, the final admission of defeat. Thorne smiled, a thin, cruel slash in the darkness. "There it is, gentlemen. The truth always comes out on this beach." Miller didn't hear him. He heard only the roaring in his ears and the frantic, broken beating of his own heart. He was a failure. He had come here to prove something to himself, and he had proven only that Thorne was right. He was empty. He reached the grinder. The asphalt was cold beneath his bare feet. The bell seemed to glow under the harsh floodlights. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth metal. "It's over." He curled his fingers around the rope lanyard. "Trainee." The voice was calm, authoritative, and utterly out of place in the chaos of Hell Week. It cut through the night like a blade. Miller froze, his hand still on the rope. He turned. Standing at the edge of the grinder was a tall, lean figure in a crisp, starched uniform. The gold stripes on his sleeve gleamed. An admiral. His face was lined with the wisdom of command, his eyes sharp and assessing. Miller recognized him from the initial briefing a lifetime ago. Admiral Vance, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. Thorne and his instructors snapped to attention, their mockery instantly replaced by rigid professionalism. "Admiral," Thorne said, his voice tight. Vance ignored him. His gaze was fixed on Miller. He walked forward slowly, his polished shoes making no sound on the asphalt. He stopped a few feet from the bell. "You were about to ring that bell, son," Vance said. It wasn't a question. Miller couldn't speak. He just nodded, his throat thick with shame. "Before you do," the Admiral continued, his voice even, "protocol requires you state your full name and service number for the official record of your departure." Miller swallowed. He had to force the words out. "Miller, John, 845-21-7734 inch." The Admiral's eyes narrowed slightly. He took another step closer. The air crackled with a strange tension. That's the name on your uniform, sailor. I want your true name. The one on your birth certificate. Miller's blood ran cold, colder than the Pacific. The one thing he had tried to bury, the legacy he had run from, was being exhumed under the floodlights of his greatest failure. Sir, he stammered. Your name, Vance repeated, his voice hardening. State it. That is an order. A silence fell over the grinder. The only sound was the distant crash of waves. Miller looked from the Admiral's unyielding face to Thorne's confused, impatient scowl. He closed his eyes. The memory of a different voice, a father's voice, echoed in his mind. A name is a responsibility. Son, never forget that. He opened his eyes. He took a breath. Kalen, he said, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. My name is John Kalen. The name dropped into the silence like a stone. Nothing happened. For a moment, there was only confusion. Then, Instructor Thorne took an involuntary step back. His face, tanned and weathered, went slack. The color drained from it, leaving a sickly, pale sheen under the lights. His mouth opened slightly. An older senior chief, standing nearby, stared at Miller, his eyes wide with disbelief, then shot a look at Thorne filled with something like horror. The whispers started among the senior cadre, a rustle of sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Kalen, Admiral Vance let the name hang in the air for a long moment before he spoke again, his voice ringing with clarity across the courtyard. For those of you too young to know, let me clarify. This is John Kalen, son of Master Chief Elias Kalen. An audible gasp went through the ranks of the instructors. The trainees, too exhausted and ignorant of the lore to understand, simply watched bewildered. But the instructors knew. Every seasoned operator in the naval special warfare community knew that name. Master Chief Elias Kalen, a founding member of SEAL Team 6, a man whose exploits in Mogadishu and the Hindu Kush were the stuff of legend. A ghost operator whose file was so heavily redacted it was mostly black ink. He was a titan, a benchmark against which all others were measured. He had died in a training exercise years ago, a hero's end, pushing his men to safety before a catastrophic equipment failure. His name was whispered with a reverence reserved for the gods of the teams. And Thorne had just spent 5 days torturing his son. He had called a Kalen empty. He had said his name was not worth remembering. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. Thorne looked as if he had been punched in the gut. His entire career, his reputation as a maker of men, his unerring judgment, it all crumbled to dust in that single, shattering moment. He enlisted under his mother's maiden name, Vance explained, his eyes still locked on the trainee formerly known as Miller. He didn't want special treatment. He wanted to earn it on his own, or fail on his own. Vance turned his gaze to Thorne. The temperature on the grinder seemed to drop another 20 degrees. You seem to have done your level best to accommodate that second option, Instructor Thorne. Thorne's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He was undone. Kalen stood there, stripped bare not by the cold, but by the weight of his own name. The anonymity he had craved was gone, burned away by the Admiral's words. He was no longer Miller, the ghost. He was Kalen, the son. The legacy, it felt heavier than the log. He looked at the bell. Then he looked at his hands, scraped and bleeding. Laugh now. You won't soon. He let go of the rope. Sir, Kalen said, his voice finding a new strength, a new timbre. I'm not quitting. Vance nodded slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. I know. Your father wouldn't have either. He turned to the assembled instructors. Secure your trainee. Get him to the medical bay. He's hypothermic. Thorne finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate sound. Sir, with all due respect, he is a performance drop. He failed the navigation exercise. His boat crew collapsed. He was on his way to ring the bell. He is done. It was a plea, a desperate attempt to salvage his own judgment. Vance's expression became granite. The compass you issued him was defective by 3 degrees, Instructor. I had to check myself this afternoon. You gave him a ghost needle. As for his boat crew, he's been carrying the lead weight for them for 2 days straight. The only reason they made it this far is because he put them on his back. I have been watching. The condemnation was absolute. Thorn flinched as if struck. He had not just misjudged a trainee. He had actively, if subconsciously, sabotaged the son of a legend. He had tried to break a man he should have been trying to build. But that doesn't matter now, Vance said, his voice turning sharp. Legacy isn't given. It is earned. Every single day, he looked back at Kalen. Your father's name gets you one thing, and one thing only. It gets you this. Vance gestured to the obstacle course looming in the darkness at the edge of the grinder. The O course, a series of brutal walls, ropes, and pits designed to test strength and agility on a good day. For a man at the tail end of Hell Week, it was a death sentence. The final evolution of Hell Week is the Circulator, a 4-mile timed run in the soft sand. We're going to make an exception tonight, Vance declared. Tonight, we run the Kalen test. Your father set the course record here in 1992. He did it after 3 days of a field exercise with 2 cracked ribs and a sprained ankle. The record has never been broken. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Beat the record, Kalen, and you're not just a SEAL. You're Kalen. Fail, and you ring that bell yourself. It was an impossible task. A cruel, sans proposition. It was a test not of the body, but of the blood. Thorne started to object again. Admiral, he's in no condition. It's medically irresponsible. His father was in no condition, Vance countered, his voice like ice. The enemy on the battlefield does not care about your condition. Get the timers ready. Kalen looked at the course. The dark shapes of the obstacles were monstrous against the night sky. He felt a wave of dizziness. His body was a wreck. Every muscle was screaming. He had nothing left. Then he thought of his father. He thought of the name. He thought of Thorne's sneering face. I didn't come to win. I came to show them who I am. A medic approached him with a bottle of water and a protein bar. Kalen waved him off. He walked to the starting line, his stride unsteady but resolute. The other trainees of his class, Class 234, were gathered by the instructors, their own misery forgotten as they watched this impossible drama unfold. On my mark, an instructor called out, his voice now laced with a new, uncertain respect. Kalen took a deep breath. The cold air burned his lungs. He felt a strange calm settle over him. The exhaustion was still there, but it was now a separate thing, a passenger he had to carry. He was no longer just John Miller, the failing trainee. He was his father's son, and he had a debt to pay. Go! He exploded from the line. His movement was shocking. Gone was the stumbling, shuffling gait of the broken man. He ran with a desperate, hungry energy, his legs pumping, his arms driving. He hit the first obstacle, a 10-foot wall, and went up and over it with a fluid economy of motion that defied his physical state. He landed and kept running. The crowd of instructors was silent, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. Thorne stood frozen, his face ashen. Kalen reached the dirty name, a series of high hurdles. He cleared them without breaking stride. His form was not perfect. It was raw, ragged, fueled by sheer will. He flowed over the weaver, an obstacle that required him to weave his body over and under a series of logs. His movements were precise, almost mechanical. It was as if another mind, another set of muscles, had taken over his body. The memory of his father's training, the backyard drills from his childhood that he had resented, now came back to him as instinct. He reached the rope climb. 30 feet of thick rope, straight up. His arms were screaming, shaking violently. He paused for a fraction of a second at the base, looking up. He could hear Thorne's voice in his head. Empty. No heart. He launched himself onto the rope. Hand over hand. He ignored the burn. He ignored the screaming of his tendons. He climbed. His mind went blank. There was only the rope and the top and the name. He slapped the beam at the top and slid down, the rope burning his hands, but he didn't feel it. He was already running towards the next obstacle. The other trainees watched in stunned silence. This was not the man they had trained with for months. This was not Miller, the quiet backbencher. This was someone else. This was a force of nature. Chun, his face streaked with grime and tears, watched with his mouth agape. He was witnessing a resurrection. An instructor held a stopwatch, calling out splits to the Admiral. "He's ahead of the pace, sir," the instructor said, his voice trembling with excitement. "He's 30 seconds ahead of the record pace at the halfway point." Thorne heard this, and a muscle in his jaw clenched. He was watching his own world burn to the ground, and John Kalin was the match. Kalin came to the final and most feared obstacle, the slide for life. It was a 50-foot tower with a rope slide down to a cargo net. It required a final burst of strength and courage. He scrambled up the cargo net to the top of the tower, his lungs heaving. He didn't pause. He grabbed the rope, swung his legs over, and launched himself into the dark void. He hit the cargo net on the other side, bounced, and dropped to the ground, rolling to his feet and sprinting for the finish line. The final 100 yards. His legs were lead. His vision was tunneling. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears. He could see the faces at the finish line, blurs in the harsh light. He saw the Admiral. He saw Thorne. He pushed. He drove his legs one last time, pumping his arms, a guttural roar tearing from his throat. It was a sound of pure, primal defiance. He crossed the line and collapsed, his body finally surrendering. He lay on the asphalt, chest heaving, unable to move. The instructor with the stopwatch stared at it, his eyes wide. He looked at the Admiral, then back at the watch, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Time," Admiral Vance asked, his voice steady. The instructor had to clear his throat. "Sir, he broke it. He broke the record. By 17 seconds. A wave of hushed awe rolled through the assembled men. 17 seconds. It was an eternity. A man who had been medically and spiritually broken, a man who was seconds from quitting, had just shattered a legendary record set by his own heroic father. Kalin lay on the ground, the world spinning. Medics rushed to his side, but Admiral Vance held up a hand, stopping them. He walked over and knelt beside the exhausted trainee. Kalin looked up into the Admiral's eyes. Vance simply placed a hand on his shoulder. "Welcome back, Kalin," he said quietly. Then he stood and turned to the stunned instructors and trainees. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he said, his voice resonating with command. "You do not judge a man by his fatigue. You do not judge him by his silence. You judge him by the fire that is revealed when he is set aflame. Class 234, he bellowed. Secure your classmate. Hell Week is over." A ragged, exhausted cheer went up from the trainees. They surged forward, lifting Kalin onto their shoulders. He was too weak to resist. They carried him, their new icon, their brother, off the grinder. As they passed Thorne, Kalin met his eyes. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a quiet, final statement. Thorne looked away, his face a mask of utter and complete humiliation. His spirit, unlike Kalin's, was irrevocably broken. The immediate aftermath was swift and quiet. Instructor Thorne was reassigned the next morning. There was no formal punishment, no public shaming. He was simply moved to a desk job at a recruitment center in North Dakota. For a man like Thorne, a warrior whose entire identity was forged on the grinder, it was a fate worse than being discharged. He became a ghost himself, a cautionary tale whispered among the instructors. John Kalin graduated BUD/S at the top of his class. He never spoke of that night on the grinder. He didn't have to. The story became legend. The Kalin test became an unofficial part of the lore, a story told to new trainees to remind them of the history they were inheriting and the depths they might find within themselves. Kalin refused any and all special assignments or recognitions that came from his name. He earned his trident and melted into the ranks of the teams, becoming a quiet, hyper-competent operator known for his calm under fire and his unwavering loyalty to the men on his left and right. He led not with his voice, but with his actions. He was a Kalin, but he was his own man. Years later, now a senior chief himself, Kalin stood on that same beach at Coronado, watching a new class of trainees suffer through their own Hell Week. A young, nervous instructor approached him. "Senior Chief," the instructor said, "we've got one we're worried about. Trainee Chun. Good kid, but he's fading. He's got quitting eyes. We're thinking of pushing him a little harder, seeing if he'll break. Kalen turned and looked at the shivering form of the young trainee in the surf. He remembered another shivering trainee, a farm boy who had been next to him under a log. This wasn't the same Chun, but the name was enough. He looked back at the young instructor. "No," Kalen said, his voice calm and firm. "You're not going to push him. You're going to put him in the middle of a log. You're going to put his strongest men on either side of him, and you're going to get him his sunrise." The instructor was confused. "But, Senior Chief, the standard is to build warriors," Kalen interrupted, his eyes hard as steel. "Not to feed our own egos by breaking them. You never know what a man is truly carrying." The instructor snapped to attention. "Yes, Senior Chief." He hurried off to relay the new orders. Kalen watched the sun begin its ascent, casting a golden light on the water. He had run from his name once, fearing its shadow. Now, he wore it as armor, not for himself, but for the men he led. The legacy was not a record on a wall or a story told in a bar. It was a living thing, passed on in the quiet acts of leadership, in the protection of a struggling brother, and in the unwavering belief that inside every man there's a fire waiting for the right moment to burn.